Hi, and welcome to the Always Evolving podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. So many of us struggle with things such as perfectionism, people pleasing, and really just putting a lot of pressure on ourselves. These expectations often lead to us shaming ourselves when inevitably we aren't able to live up to these impossible standards. And joining us today is Hannah Schlueter, licensed associate counselor. And Hannah is here to provide some tips and insights on how we can start moving from a place of self-shame to self-compassion.
It's okay that we don't have it all figured out. We're all just taking it a day at a time. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi, how are you?
Good. I'm so happy to have you here. Your sweet face is just so exciting to have here. And also, did I butcher your last name before we move forward?
I don't think so. I honestly was a little too nervous to listen, but I think you did great.
Well, that works for me then. Just keep you distracted with your nervousness, and mine is not as big of a deal. I'm going to tell everyone who doesn't know you who you are and what you do.
Hi, so I'm Hannah Schlueter. I'm a licensed associate counselor at Evolve. I see children, teens, and adults, and I kind of help them navigate just the daily challenges in individual, couple, family settings.
Yes, and you are an incredible therapist with an incredible heart, and we are so lucky to have you at Evolve. Tell us, when we're talking about the self-shame piece, which is so common. I mean, we see that with our clients so often, probably, I would say almost with every client. There's some level of that shame that goes on for them. How do you help someone to identify that and even start navigating through it?
That's a great question. So I think part of one of the modalities that I use is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so kind of reflecting on the shame part is the main question that I ask is, and what do you believe about yourself because of that action, that behavior, that situation? Because what happens is shame is a self-evaluative emotion. So it involves concern and attention about oneself. So if you kind of look inward, you can look at, okay, how am I evaluating myself based off of my behavior, my feelings, my response to the situation? And that kind of targets my awareness of their shame, kind of helps them reflect on how they're feeling about it.
And when we look at it from that lens of, where that shame originally came from, and thinking about, the influence of our upbringing and the influence of these messages that we receive from our caregivers, whether intended or not, do you usually trace that self-shame back to those experiences, or where do you most often see that the self-shame is rooted in?
Yeah, it's a lot of the time, like we said, it's upbringing, right? So whether that be parents, friends, coaches, social media, especially in this age, it's also how you learned from your caregivers, from your environment, how to respond to mistakes. So if your caregivers and your environment was shameful about their mistakes, even if they weren't inherently shameful to you, that was modeled for you and you took that on and you learned that. So that's a really big pattern that we look at. Again, even if it's not placing blame on someone for giving you this pattern, it is important to look at how that affected you.
That's such a great point. And Brene Brown talks about that in the, the gifts of imperfect parenting?
Like gifts of imperfection, I think, or something like that.
Well, because she has the gifts of imperfection as the book, but then she has this 2-hour audible on that's just more like a talk, and it's the gifts of imperfect parenting, I think it is. And she talks about how that is so important as a parent to be aware of, that even if we aren't directly shaming our children or being hypercritical of them, that they're watching how we react to our mistakes and how we're basically navigating through life and treating ourselves. And that's such an important point to make, that role modeling makes a big difference as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of those indirect patterns that parents don't always recognize, oh, I'm not shaming my kid, or, coaches or whatever that may be. But if you're responding to yourself that way, I mean, they're going to pick that up. They're going to recognize that that's normal to do that. And they're going to take that and speak to themselves that same way as well.
Right. And just even thinking of, making a simple mistake and being like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, things like that. And they're listening and they're picking up on those messages.
Exactly.
Well, how do we see it show up then in adulthood? Well, a lot of us know because we live it, but what are some examples for, people listening of I guess even let's start by defining what self-shame even is. So they're so common, it is mixed up, that guilt and shame being the same thing. And as you and I know, they are not. So how do you define them and make that distinction?
So self-shaming is really just the cognitive and behavioral practice of like devaluing yourself. And I think guilt maybe differs of like, you maybe weren't acting in alignment with one's values, I guess, of how you responded, but that's not always placing a certain value on yourself. I think of guilt as like an emotion almost. And then the self-shaming is like the assumption and the judgment behind it.
Yeah, so shame really being the belief. So guilt might be like this fleeting emotion that we have of I've done something wrong, but shame is this belief that I am wrong, and really impacts us in a lot of ways we don't even realize because of it being that type of belief. And so how do you see it show up? How are you, how is it manifesting in a lot of our lives?
Yeah. I think the most common way is like the habits that you try to move towards and maybe you want to be better at, or those changes that you want to make in your life that you start off really well with and then it kind of falls off, or you make a mistake and you feel like you're starting back over. So it's really like the most frequent, like the most common way I see it is just unsustainable change, whether that be like small behaviors, like, hobbies like exercise or something, or just like change and like reacting a different way, managing anger, different emotions. It's not lasting because of the way that you're evaluating yourself when you mess up.
So it's like we have these good intentions to, okay, I'm going to start doing X, Y, and Z. But because our belief system is so deeply ingrained in this idea of maybe I'm not worthy or I'm not valuable, I won't be able to do it anyway, then we end up whether self-sabotaging or just giving up because the belief system is that I'm not worthy, I'm not capable.
Yeah. And I think what I see too is the motivator for self-shaming is a lot of like, if I'm not hard on myself and if I'm not, this mean or this critical, then I don't care enough to change or it won't change. And then self, compassion that we'll talk about in a bit feels like coddling. So it's like, well, I need to be mean. I need to be tough love in order for me to care enough. And that's really where we're getting stuck. It's like the vicious cycle that brings us back.
For sure. And so, yeah, let's segue into that. So how do we start to bring awareness to this self-shame, work through it, and then move towards the self-compassion?
Yeah, well, so my 3 steps, right? So one is kind of 2-part, acknowledge that the self-shame isn't working and really kind of reflect on what that looks like, what you say to yourself, what you believe about yourself, kind of like we talked about how that shows up and how you respond to your mistakes. It's going to be hard. And when you look at like the pattern of self-shaming, it often can bring hope of like, oh, I'll just tell myself I'm not good enough unless I do this. And it might feel motivating. But when we can finally acknowledge that it's just bringing us back to these unsustainable, like roller coaster of self-esteem is what I call it, you're more likely to kind of take an honest look in the mirror and go, okay, something needs to adjust here. 2 is we're going to respond with questions, not assumptions or judgments. Whether that be, so for example, let's take a habit of exercising that you wanted to do and you're not meeting that. Instead of like, oh my gosh, I'm lazy, I can't do it. It's like, what is actually not working? Did my schedule kind of bring some unexpected changes, right? Was I not prepared? Like stuff like that. Really asking what the barriers are leads to honesty, solution-based thinking, rather than I'm lazy, perpetuating low self-esteem and falling into that really unpleasant emotion of guilt and or self-doubt, whatever accompanies that too.
Sure. Yeah. So having awareness around it and acknowledging that this is what exists, and then asking the questions so that we're not, because the assumption is that we aren't worthy or we aren't capable versus, hey, maybe there was a glitch in my schedule or maybe something came up. And then is that the final step, or like?
Well, so I think that's what we want to continue to practice. But I think my final tip would be to get comfortable with like neutrality. And I think that that's hard because oftentimes with failure, there's a lot of moral assumptions about it, and I think the feelings about disappointment and not making those changes that you are totally valid. The feelings can be there without holding any judgment about it. So if we can acknowledge and validate the feeling, but maintain a neutral stance, that really gives us the space to, again, go back to the curiosity, respond with questions rather than judgment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that we don't have to label ourselves because
Exactly.
and get it exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes. Great insights, great help. Thank you so much. Where can people find you, Hannah? Where are you online, social media?
So I'm on Instagram. It's at Mental Health with Han. And that's where you can find me, post some good resources, all that fun stuff.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on the Always Evolving podcast. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick.
This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz.